Why do pain and suffering exist? It's a question that bothers us every time we think about it, or even when we go through a situation where this suffering is present. The suffering we are talking about here is not just physical, but should also be understood more broadly as suffering from doubt, or as a result of our bad choices and existential dilemmas. The suffering of being aware that we have the awareness that things can go wrong, but especially the suffering of thinking that life may not have meaning. And you must have also wondered, if there were no pain and suffering, would life be better? Could it be that if I could only make good choices that brought me happiness, would I really be a happy and fulfilled person? These questions are not new. Countless thinkers have tried to find a satisfactory answer. From philosophy in ancient Greece to modern times, philosophers have tried to find ways and methods to make life good to live despite the suffering. Until, in 1821, a man was born who was not necessarily a philosopher, but a novelist who understood human nature very well and said, "What if we need suffering?" We are talking about Fyodor Dostoevsky, one of the greatest exponents of Russian and world literature. Just so you have an idea of the magnitude of Dostoevsky's books, Nietzsche, a philosopher you may know who was a contemporary of Dostoevsky, wrote the following about him. Dostoevsky is the only psychologist from whom I have something to learn. He belongs to the unexpected happiness of my life. Indeed, Dostoevsky masterfully understood the human condition, largely due to his troubled and extremely suffering life. His parents died before he turned 25, and he constantly suffered from epileptic seizures. Religion was very present in Dostoevsky's life, and he always considered himself an Orthodox Christian, which greatly influenced his works, especially those from his later years, which are filled with moral dilemmas and religious themes. For Dostoevsky, the only way to understand humans is through their religious dimension, through their involvement with eternity, where there is a limit that reason can no longer explain. Many people think that Dostoevsky is an atheist because of the impression they get from his works, since his characters are often portrayed in a way that goes completely against any religious solution. But no, he creates some of these characters to demonstrate precisely the impossibility of humans shutting themselves off from this religious dimension. However, despite his deep-rooted Christianity, he started frequenting circles of socialist intellectuals who discussed literary works after he began to fall into debt, since his early writings did not achieve the prestige he had imagined. These groups that Dostoevsky frequented included the so-called Petrochevsky Circle, which served as a front for a clandestine society with the goal of provoking a revolution and overthrowing the Tsar of the time, as Russia was still a monarchy. However, with the government's persecution of these societies in 1849, Dostoevsky was discovered and sentenced to death by a firing squad, but his sentence was merely a simulation by the government, and at the last minute before the executioner pulled the trigger, Dostoevsky was informed that his true sentence was imprisonment with forced labor in the harsh cold of Siberia. It is from this moment that Dostoevsky's perception of life changes forever, and his religious convictions become increasingly strong. Joseph Frank, Dostoevsky's biographer, writes that as a consequence of his exile, Dostoevsky's secular Christianity underwent a crucial metamorphosis. Until then, he had been dedicated to improving life on earth. Now this goal, without being abandoned, was overshadowed by an awareness of the importance of the hope of eternal life as an aid to moral existence. His time in prison also convinced him that the need for freedom, in particular, the feeling of being able to exercise his free will, was an inextirpable need of the human personality and could express itself even in apparently self-destructive ways, if no other way out was possible. Well, pay close attention to this passage I just cited because it will be important for the understanding of the video. After returning to Russia, after 10 years of exile in Siberia, he was totally disillusioned that a revolution would be the solution for humanity, and abandoned the socialist ideals that theorized this paradise on earth, so to speak. However, he realized that the Russian generation of the 1860s had been taken over by a kind of rationalist utilitarianism, disseminated mainly by Chernyshevsky, a revolutionary intellectual of the time who believed that a new man would emerge from a true revolution, where he would be completely re-educated by science, which would show that he has no desires or whims, that is, that he has no free will, because his behavior would be totally mapped, so that everything he did would not happen by his will, but according to the determinism of the laws of nature. Once this point was clarified, Chernyshevsky believed that man would be unable to behave irrationally and would do everything advantageous to himself. In this way, he believed that all human suffering could be extirpated through this utilitarian man, conditioned only to achieve results and fulfill objectives, not seeking anything other than his happiness. And here, happiness would be only material goods, since Chernyshevsky denied any kind of transcendence. Well, it was then that Dostoevsky launched, in the mid-1860s, his book Notes from Underground, which, besides being a critique of the currents of utilitarianism and extreme determinism that were taking over Russia, is also a parody of Chernyshevsky's thought, a parody of that extremely rational man who denies free will, who behaves in the most advantageous way possible for himself, who acts as a result of a chain of causes that produce the most appropriate behavior for a given situation. Well, for Dostoevsky, accepting the premises of Chernyshevsky's new man and taking him to his ultimate consequences is impossible because it would imply an internal conflict in the contradictory nature of man, who has the ability to choose even what is not advantageous for himself. Yes, our greatest advantage is being able to exercise our free will and choose even what harms us. Our personality manifests in choices that include the possibility of their denial. Otherwise, it is not a choice, and otherwise, we have no personality. However, in a certain part of the book, the underground man, who is the character of the book, he has no name. So this is how the character was known in posterity as the underground man. He says the following: "All right, if it were really possible to map all the advantages of the human being, so that it would be impossible for him to choose the irrational, that all actions could be predicted, specified, and placed in a sort of spreadsheet, so that it would be possible to anticipate them, and that all suffering as a result of our bad choices could be avoided, and the human being could be covered with abundance and material goods. Against all this, the underground man writes, man is so monstrously ungrateful that he will risk even his pound cake and intentionally desire the most destructive absurdity, the most uneconomical, his most vulgar stupidity, just to confirm to himself that men are always men, and not piano keys." Piano keys are how Chernyshevsky himself referred to the mapped behavior of that new man he described. So, to the underground man, even if it were proven that the human being is a piano key, that is, a determined and predictable product, the human being would go mad and invent chaos and destruction just to prove his point, to have his whims satisfied and his awareness that he has desires. The underground man denies that the human being really wants to achieve happiness. He denies that humanity is eager to reach earthly peace and prosperity, which would mean the end of history and the cessation of all effort and hope. We want to desire to reach, but never to reach. We love the goal from afar, but never up close. Reaching the goal would mean giving up suffering, but for the underground man, suffering constitutes an important factor for the meaning of life. It's not that the underground man is defending suffering for its own sake, but the whim of having it ensured when necessary, as this is an irreversible consequence of free will, to desire what is not advantageous for us. Suffering, then, would be a moral assertion in the face of the absence of human meaning imposed by determinism. The ability to doubt, to make wrong choices, to contradict oneself means that man has not turned into a machine and can only behave in a certain way. Our building is also supported by our defects and by paths where we can doubt their advantages. This is the whole construction of human personality. But after all, who is the underground man? And what is the underground? The underground man must be someone very at peace with life to be able to think this way, to deny any kind of solution to the possible annihilation of suffering. But, well, it's not quite like that. Despite all these questions, the underground man is someone who got lost in the infinite, in the sea of possibilities that he calls hyperatrophied consciousness. He is actually vain about his own intelligence, as he managed to perceive things that men of action, as he calls the utilitarian man of Chernyshevsky, could not perceive. The underground man is trapped in so many possibilities that he can't move forward. At the beginning of the book, he says he is not a bad guy, but his altruistic feelings for others are always overshadowed by his vain selfishness, paralyzing his actions because he rationalizes all the time. He thinks about regret out of mere vanity and self-love before even trying to do anything. As a result of his vanity, the underground man thinks he is unique, deserving everyone's friendship because of his intelligence and the things he can talk about. All individuals in the underground think they are unique, when in fact they are all similar, incapable of loving anything other than themselves. This is the underground, the place where those who have turned their vanity into the totality of their being go. It is a kind of pathological manifestation against determinism, against the idea that the human being is formed by a chain of causes that prevent him from having free will. The underground man is in the underground because he chose something harmful to simply affirm himself. Dostoevsky is telling us, the reader, not to be like this guy, not to be someone who deprives himself of the ministry of others in detriment of the abyss of our total subjectivity imposed by vanity. So, for Dostoevsky, only love for others when we forget ourselves can save the human being. Love, for Dostoevsky, is beyond reason, which is why he does not accept men like Chernyshevsky, since loving is often doing things we don't like or that bring no advantage to ourselves. Suffering opens us up to others because if it didn't exist, we would close in on ourselves. But he knows that there is something in human nature that always pulls him toward himself, that needs to self-affirm at all times. He tried to demonstrate this difficulty with the underground man. Someone who says, "Screw the others, I am alone, they are all," is glimpsing this abyss which is the underground. But then, after all this, you might be thinking, isn't it better to be a piano key? A product of the laws of nature that has no rest, where all sufferings have been abolished, right? In other words, an action-oriented utilitarian man? Well, the underground man tried to be this man. He intellectually accepts the premises of the new man of action and becomes a piano key, as I mentioned. But at all times, his moral conscience, which should be extirpated by scientific logic through the determinism of nature where any emotional reaction like anger, for example, would be considered irrational and purposeless, would soon be annihilated. In fact, this moral conscience juxtaposes itself to maintain a sense of dignity, to have at least a minimum of an inherently human reaction. This shameful pleasure in one's own vanity was the way the underground man found to refuse the renunciation of his right to have a conscience, even if he feels degraded. It is like the right to have some whim, that is, a kind of stubbornness just to contradict and prove that others are wrong. Well, at the moment, I can't think of anything more characteristic of the human being than the desire to contradict, right, even if he has all the proofs indicating the contrary. And that's exactly the point. At some point, no rationality will be a match for our whim. Even knowing that something can harm us, we can still simply take that something out of mere stubbornness, or thinking in another way. How many times have you not done something you knew was beneficial or healthy for yourself, but still didn't do it simply because you had the choice not to? As Pond, a Brazilian philosopher and writer, writes in a text dedicated to the book, when he, the underground man, affirms that what makes consciousness possible is suffering and pain, he bets on the idea that, when man is cornered by determinism, he will say, "To hell with the world as long as I have my tea."